guys? Welcome to episode 31 of the Data Driven Strength Podcast. Today, Josh and I are going to be going over two segments today. One, Josh is going to talk about exercise variation and how that can impact both strength and hypertrophy gains in the way that we set up our weekly training structure. After that, we'll talk a little bit about volume load, work capacity, and some thoughts that I've had on how that may be pertinent for individuals working through chronic aches and pains. Just on the front end of the podcast, obviously check out the description for some of the things we offer, as well as all of the relevant studies that we'll be discussing within the segments that we talk about today. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Josh here to get started on his first segment here, talking about within week exercise variation.
Yeah, man. So the reason I wanted to do this segment is because a new paper came out, I think a couple weeks ago now, at least a couple weeks ago from the time of recording this, looking at variation of exercises within a week and how that kind of influences 1RM strength gain. So the exact paper will be linked in the description, as Zach just said. And the title is, Does Varying Resistance Exercises for the Same Muscle Group Promote Greater Strength Gains? So this was a 9-week training study. There were 23 subjects that were analyzed, and the subjects had training experience in the past for, I think they said 6 months, but they had not been training for 4 months prior. So I think a good way to characterize these subjects is that they were detrained. So they had trained before, they were no longer training for the previous 4 months. Their 1RM bench presses were around 60 kilos. So, more or less untrained, detrained type of subjects here. Okay. So they looked at the outcomes of interest were 1 rep max in a bunch of exercises. So the bench press, lat pull down, bicep curl, tricep extension, leg press, leg curl on the right leg, and leg curl on the left leg. I'm going to focus on 1RM strength gains in the bench press and the leg press because that's going to be most relevant to listeners, and also the findings there kind of represent all the other ones as well. So in terms of the specifics of the study design, the subjects trained 3 times per week, and they were split up into 2 groups. So both groups had a set volume throughout the week of 9 sets per muscle group / movement pattern. All of the sets were 8 to 12 reps, and based on the way they described the execution of the training, all these sets seem to be 2 or close to failure. So I'm going to give these groups different names than what the paper actually calls them. So I'm going to call it a specific group and a variation group. So the specific group trained the exercises tested in all sessions. So in other words, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they trained all those exercises I went through that were tested for 1 rep max in that exact order. So they went bench press, 3 sets of 8 to 12, 2 are close to failure, lat pull down, 3 sets, 8 to 12, bicep curl, tricep extension, leg press, leg curl, just like that. Okay. So that's the specific group. Then we have the variation group, and they trained those exercises tested in session 1. So just like I explained. So day 1 was the exact same between the specific and the variation group. Okay. But then for days 2 and days 3, they did a very similar kind of setup, but with variations of those lifts. So for example, instead of doing bench press on day 2, they did incline bench press on day 2. On day 3, instead of doing bench press, they did decline bench press, right? So again, just to kind of recap, if we use the bench press as an example, specific group training 3 sets of the bench press, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Variation group, Monday, they're training the bench press 3 sets. Wednesday, they're training incline bench press for 3 sets. Friday, they're training decline bench press for 3 sets. Okay. And basically this question is getting at exactly what the title of the study says, is like, hey, if we vary exercises for that muscle group or for that general movement pattern, is that going to impact strength gains positively or negatively? And overall, there was no significant differences in 1RM strength gains. So for the bench press, basically as close as it can get in terms of between group effect sizes. Based on my calculations, there was a between group effect size of 0.04. So basically nothing. that was in favor of the specific group, but again, basically no difference at all that is even of note. And then for the leg press, this was, a little bit more of like something, I guess, in terms of the effect size. My calculations brought the between group effect size to 0.16 in favor of the specific group, which isn't even reaching the small, which isn't even meeting the threshold for a small effect size. So again, basically no differences between group, no significant differences, no between group effect sizes that you would really bat an eye at. Okay. So overall, this study, at least in these subjects, which again are basically untrained subjects, whether you're doing the lift you're actually performing, like you're performing your 1 rep max test on 3 times per week or just once a week with variations the other 2 sessions per week, doesn't really seem to make a difference in terms of strength gains. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's look at 2 other studies because overall, it's just one study. We want to kind of take a more high level look at kind of the research. And I think there's 2 relevant studies that kind of help us paint a better picture here. Okay. So the first is by Fonseca and colleagues. Again, this one will be linked in the description. This is a very well cited study and people talk about it a lot. And I'm just going to kind of simplify the design here for the purposes of exercise variation. There were actually 4 groups in the study, but again, I'm just kind of simplifying things here to focus on exercise selection and exercise variation. So there was one approach in which they only performed the Smith machine squat in all of their training sessions. There was another approach in which they performed the Smith machine squat, the leg press, the deadlift, and lunges within a training session. Okay. And in this case, there were actually greater 1RM strength gains in the groups that performed multiple exercises. So in this case, we're kind of seeing that, hey, this variation performing more than just the specific exercise leads to greater 1 rep max strength gains. Interestingly, they also saw more homogeneous quadriceps growth in the group performing multiple exercises, which is also kind of backed up by some other studies as well. Okay. So again, if we take a step back, we have this first study that kind of indicates that additional variation within the week doesn't seem to have a super positive effect or a super negative effect. Now we have this Fonseca study, which were also untrained individuals, indicating that varying exercises seems to actually have a positive effect on 1 rep max strength gains. Okay. The last study I want to go over is one by Rossi and colleagues. And they compared a group training just leg press to a group comparing just squat to a group comparing squat and leg press. Okay. So the results of this study actually paint a really clear kind of like specificity picture here. So the group that was training just, if we think about 1 rep max squat gains, the group that was performing just squats saw the greatest 1 RM squat gains, followed by the group training half of their work doing squats, half of their group training leg press, followed by the group training just leg press. Okay. Now, interestingly, they also measured 1 rep max leg press in this study, and they saw that comparing just training leg press to training squat and leg press saw pretty similar leg press 1 RM strength gains. So in other words, we saw a greater degree of transferability from one exercise to another when it was squat to leg press. Okay. And that leads me to a kind of overarching point I want to make on these 3 studies, which I think are kind of a good summary of the research on this topic, is that there's probably going to be a greater transfer of variations to exercises that are more fixed, that are more machine-based. So something like a leg press or a Smith machine squat compared to something like a free weight back squat. Okay, so if we go back to that first study, for the lower body, they tested the leg press. Okay, and again, variations didn't seem to have, they seem to carry over just as well, right? The Fonseca paper, again, this was the Smith machine squat. They saw greater improvements in Smith machine 1 rep max strength when doing variations in addition to the, instead of just doing more Smith machine squat work. But then in this Rossi study, this was the only one in which the squat was a free weight squat, and they didn't see that doing half of their work on leg press, that didn't transfer as well as just doing more squats. Okay. So I think a takeaway here from these 3 studies is that yes, variations can contribute to strength gains, but this may be especially true in a less skilled movement. Okay. And all of these subjects were untrained. So, we should probably take a step back and think about like how to use these concepts in practice, because as always, the way studies are set up, we're more so looking at these concepts as opposed to, telling us exactly what to do in the gym. But I will pause there and see if, Zach, you have any questions or things you think we should clarify before moving on.
The first question you may not have the answer to, because I know you mentioned you're just going to focus on the bench and the leg press, but do you know if the rest of the effect sizes in the first study that you mentioned all kind of leaned in favor of the specific group for the most part?
I'm not totally sure off the top of my head. I can pull up they have some nice visuals in this study actually,
Cool.
but
Okay.
not necessarily. So I'm looking at it right now. No,
Because
not necessarily.
I guess one thing I was wondering with that was, is it the fact that the effect sizes are actually small, or is it just the fact that they're untrained individuals, meaning the divergent kind of outcomes are difficult to spot just because, anything's going to work at that point in time? But the rest of the conversation kind of paints the overall picture that you were kind of discussing there that I think it's really interesting. And to me, I guess one of the practical things that I thought of is that it's really, really important when you are designing training to do 2 things. One is to ask yourself what the goal of the exercise is, and then also making sure the programming matches the goal that you're trying to go after with that. So I think another thing that was interesting with this is, for the most part, it seemed like the actual programming was a little bit higher rep. So if anything, maybe that's going to fight against the kind of the variation argument a little bit, because you're kind of killing 2 things there. Your the movement specificity is low, but then also the programming specificity for strength is also low. So I think you could maybe try to minimize those downsides a little bit if you were to make the programming more specific with a more highly varied approach. That's one thing I thought of. But ultimately, I think this is a good case for, again, from a practical perspective, take a step back, ask yourself, what is this movement doing for me? And then making sure everything is kind of in line with that goal. So if you're, trying to improve, your skill with a very, certain movement, even if you are going for a variation, you probably want to make that a very small tweak to attack a very specific thing within the technique of that original movement. Whereas if you're going more so for hypertrophy, I would expect that kind of integration or contribution to 1RM strength gains to take a longer period of time, which is another factor in all of these studies, right? If we're looking to improve our 1RM strength in an 8 to 12 week period, probably don't want to put most of your eggs in the hypertrophy basket there, especially with untrained individuals. That's just probably going to occur from a lot of skill learning there initially, to which, some of those more varied approaches, especially dedicated towards hypertrophy, might take a longer time to end up contributing to that kind of formula. But those are really the 2 things I had, but I thought you did a great job there kind of summarizing that. And I think this is an interesting area to watch, because I think there's a lot of different ways that, people come to justified conclusions on how to kind of, go about this. Obviously we have our kind of interpretations of this and how to do it as kind of our starting point. But there's, justified responses for people that are very, very specific, and all the way on the other side of things where people take a very highly varied approach. So yeah, I just think this is an interesting area where, we don't have a ton of high quality evidence and highly trained individuals looking at free weight movements that we're really trying to generalize this to, making the extrapolations to some degree necessary.
Yeah. Like, to be clear, like it's really, really important to realize that these studies are considerably different in their design to how we would write training and practice, right? Like I think like most of these studies are not using anything heavier than like a 6 RM at any point. Um, Whereas that's typically not going to be not going to be the case for the way we program or the way listeners of the show are writing training programs. Um, but again, the point here is to really just kind of talk about that concept, because that's what the research is for, is to give us these concepts so that we can use them and kind of see how they can be applied in practice. And again, the concept I think right now is that you don't need hyper specificity, but there's obviously a benefit to specificity, and that benefit to specificity is probably going to be higher when the movement is more skilled, right? But then, okay, now let's walk back and let's think about practice, right? And I think the best way to think about this is to think about it on an individual level, right? Because ultimately, the amount of variation that individual A is going to need is going to be different than the amount of variation that individual B is going to need or is going to see the best results from. So I have 4 points here, or like 4 things to consider when thinking about this on an individual level. Okay. So the first is, how much practice do you need, right? There's going to be diminishing returns with additional work on the specific movement. And some individuals may get away with very little of that additional work beyond just doing, a few sets on the main lift per week, right? But other individuals are really going to kind of need to rack up that additional practice. The second point is tolerance, right? Some individuals are going to tolerate the main lift, the specific lift, a lot better than others, right? So for that reason, that's going to have downstream effects on kind of where you land in terms of specificity versus variations. The third point is, how good is the main lift at growing the prime movers for that individual, right? Is this individual a really, really high arch bench presser that, at the end of the day, it's just not that good of a tool for growing their pecs? In that case, okay, we probably need a good amount of practice, but we also probably need a good amount of work away from that lift to actually grow the pecs, right? And in that little example I gave, you probably want a pretty polarized approach, in the sense of, okay, we're doing a lot of practice that's heavy and allows you to challenge that position and practice it, but then we also need a good amount of work that is actually taking the pecs through a longer range of motion and contributing to those long-term hypertrophy outcomes, right? And the fourth one is preference and engagement, right? So we kind of talk about this through the lens of muscular adaptations or skill adaptations, but I think obviously preference and engagement is going to play a role here as well. There's a study from Basval and colleagues, and I didn't include this when kind of going over the other research, because their study design was a little bit different, in which they had a group doing fixed exercise selection versus like a computerized like app situation, in which they just did like a random exercises on a session to session basis. So for that reason, like, I don't think it's very indicative of what we'd see in practice. So that's why I didn't include it. But interestingly, they measured intrinsic motivation, and they saw greater intrinsic motivation with the group doing that kind of random variation, right? So some individuals, and maybe even on average, are going to prefer greater variation and just changing it up a little bit more, even if that's like within a session or within a week. So again, to recap, the 4 things I think you should think of on an individual level: how much practice do you need? How do you tolerate the main lift? How good is the main lift at growing the prime movers? And lastly, how does the preference side of things and how that influences engagement on a lift to lift basis for the lifter in front of you? Zach, you got anything to add?
I guess the first thing is first is a question for you. When you're talking about variation there, are you talking about like what we would generally consider like hypertrophy slots primarily, or is that more like the skill slots primarily?
I'm more so thinking in terms of like volume allocation. So in terms of how much of this work are you doing on the main lift or a very close variation. I'm kind of grouping those two together. And then how much are you doing, okay, on something like a leg press or lunges or whatever the case may be. I think if we're talking specifically about like, oh, are you doing a pause bench press that's very specific, or are you doing something that's like slightly less specific and that's like a 3 count pause bench, right? To me, that's I'm kind of grouping those two together right now. And when I'm saying variation versus specificity.
Perfect. Okay, that was just making sure. So yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said. And one thing I just wrote down is kind of you were talking as an observation that I've had. That's kind of a weird paradox almost. The more, I guess, I don't know what the right word is here, but like the more hyper individualized somebody's technique gets, I guess, or like the most trying to fight the constraints of competition, or just trying to limit range of motion as much as possible, like doing all the little things with your technique to try to get every little inch out of all the constraints you can. That usually requires additional practice because it's just a more technical thing. So like obviously the example you mentioned and the one that I'm thinking of is if you're max width bencher trying to get literally every single inch out of your arch as possible, maybe even playing with, grip things that allow you to get even a little bit wider than traditionally, going through your normal grip there, and kind of putting your finger on the rings, things like that. That generally requires more practice to kind of maintain that skill. But at the same time, that is going to be time away from probably what's going to help develop that in the long term. So it's like you get this weird kind of paradox in that you need additional work to improve your skill and continue maintaining that. But at the same time, that is continuously diminishing probably the development stimulus that you get from that in the long run. And so it's an interesting problem to manage, but I think that polarized approach is ultimately what we generally come back to for the most part. And it seems to make the most sense to us. And I think, this is where we layer on, one of the topics from the podcast that we got the last time. This is where you layer on the conversation around strength limiters as well. If you have somebody whose very hyper specialized technique is also, as you get more hyper specialized, getting farther and farther away from tracking a strength limiter. So now you're like kind of shifting the bias of the movement. I haven't thought about a specific example of that, but I guess one that may come to mind is, I don't know if this is actually possible, but I'm going to put the example out there just as a thought experiment. If you take a squatter that is, let's say, a quad limited squatter, so they're generally being limited by their quads, but they adopt extremely wide stance that minimizes knee flexion at all costs. Every unit of training volume that they're now using to practice that position is also taken away from the development of the theoretical limiter there. So it gets even more so kind of compounding here. And then you also get the problem of, everybody's got a finite amount of training stress that they can recover from. And now we got to support all this stuff to make sure we're getting adequate practice and make sure that we're having enough energy to make sure we're pushing things with development. So yeah, it's just kind of an interesting conversation about how this can, on an individual level, get pretty interesting and lead to some pretty different results depending on what you're ultimately trying to do.
Yeah. So my third point there, when I was talking about like on an individual level of how good is the main lift at growing the prime movers, I think probably to take that one step further, it would be how good is the main lift at growing your specific strength limiters. And again, go back to was it the last podcast or the podcast before where we talked about that in depth? Because at the end of the day, if you're highly technical, right? And we think of like highly technical in the sense of like, that's typically going to result in a smaller range of motion, right? In general, a more technical individual is going to need to be more polarized. And I think when you think of polarization, you can think of, okay, very, very efficient skill practice, and then attacking the strength limiter. And then for someone that is more standard, okay, they can like more standard in the sense of, they don't have an extremely high bench arch, or they're not a super wide stance squatter, or their deadlift moves more than a couple inches, by the time they get to lockout. Okay, now you can probably see you can probably do more of your total volume on that main lift, and you could probably don't have to do, it probably doesn't have to be as polarized. It probably doesn't have to be as high of a percentage of 1RM for that strength work. And you can accumulate more volume on the main lift. So it's kind of like this spectrum based on strength limiters and how technical that individual is.
The thing I always think is interesting about like talking about these kind of things and like observations and spectrums and all that, you can really easily layer on anecdotes to that. So like just anecdotally, like a lot of the beginner programs for strength, right, are relatively specific. And most likely when you just get into lifting, your technique isn't super hyper specialized yet. And that just kind of like those kind of things. And interestingly, that would, perfectly go along with what you're saying. In addition to, as you get stronger, you're probably going to look to hyper specialize your technique more, or vice versa. As you hyper specialize, maybe that's when you get stronger. It's interesting to layer on all of those anecdotes and kind of see how common training recommendations reflect that, and then trying to derive what's the prescriptive part of that. No idea, but it's just interesting to see how we can kind of take a theoretical idea, somewhat taken from research, and then try to map that onto how people are actually training in the real world. I think you're muted, dude.
Oops. I said I think we can wrap it up there and move on to your segment, Zach, in which you're going to be a shill for long-term periodization.
Yeah, man. So this is something I've been thinking about. I haven't really spoke on it too much. I've been kind of sitting on these ideas for a few months as I've had a few, lifters that we've had to come to some pretty, different solutions to how I would normally handle things based on kind of the situations we were dealing with. And so really what I want to talk about here is just these revisiting kind of the idea of work capacity. And I kind of want to take it by kind of a step-by-step fashion here of like why I think this is potentially relevant for certain people. So the first thing I want to say is that in general, like my kind of saying is that the people that are the biggest and the strongest are the ones that have been doing this the longest. That's like kind of my personal saying. And I think the biggest thing
you didn't come up with that, did you?
I don't know. I really don't know. I might have heard it somewhere and just started parodying it, but I can't recall where I heard it from. But I don't know. I guess I'll take claim for it for now. But yeah, it ultimately the thing that I think most people are going to kind of have that halt in their long-term progression there is going to be just not participating anymore, and that's in most cases going to be probably due to some sort of ache, pain, injury. Now, first thing off the bat here, obviously we're not physical therapists. If you have a severe injury here, please see a professional. I'm going to talk about in the face of generally related training aches and pains, things that are nagging but are not serious. So I just want to get that out of the way on the front end here. But ultimately, most people that have been training long enough and are really trying to push their limits with this stuff are going to experience some sort of chronic ache, pain, injury, which is kind of an interesting paradox. We have a study that a lot of people like to cite about the small injury risk per participation of 1,000 participation hours of like powerlifting and strength sports, which is relatively low. But then Stronger by Science did a really cool in-house survey that kind of looked at how many people are dealing with or have dealt with injuries related to having to modify their training in some way. The definition of injury there, or definition of whatever they're kind of using as that interruption of training, is obviously something that's up for debate. But ultimately, the Stronger by Science one was pretty convincing that pretty much everybody's dealt with something or is currently dealing with something. And so to me, what that tells us is that in a lot of cases, managing these aches, pains, and things is really important. And I think a lot of times there's been some really good information that's been put out recently that allows us to handle this with kind of, more recent evidence where we can use really, it's a simple concept, but it's extremely effective of just using this concept of graded exposure, which really is just, taking you what you can currently do with, tolerable symptoms and gradually working yourself back to where you want to be over time. And I think the very basic example of that is, if Josh and I get a client, they get some sort of flare up in something, we might give them, 3 sets of 5 at a tolerable load. And then over time, as we can kind of build back, add load each week to kind of get back to, the normal training loads that they were utilizing. And then we can kind of go from there. And I think, vast majority of the time, a very simple approach like that is going to work. That said, I do think there's a lot of times where, or not a lot of times, but there are certain scenarios where these chronic aches and pains become a little bit more challenging to work around, and these more simple approaches to graded exposure may work initially. You maybe have a few weeks of oh, I'm feeling fine after 4 weeks. I kind of took a step back and I worked myself back up. But then you kind of hit this vicious cycle of re-aggravation is what I call it. And that kind of makes it so that we got to take a step back and maybe evaluate some other move that we can make here. And that's really the situation I found myself in with a few lifters, even myself, of trying to, we're nerds here trying to come up with some sort of explanation and ideas to test of ways to kind of overcome this. And this is where I kind of got on this idea about work capacity again. So coming back to the idea of graded exposure, very simple, process there, but the idea is also makes a ton of sense. Really, your body probably has some sort of, capacity. And if you're exceeding that capacity, maybe that's when you experience symptoms. None of this is set in stone, but at least from a logical working model of how we make decisions, that seems to make sense. And so the thing I started thinking about with these longer term, approaches where people are kind of having these recurrent setbacks, it may just be that our tolerance for training is extremely low. And that capacity is not sufficient to kind of overcome this threshold that continuously reproduces symptoms. And so, one of the things that I kind of started playing around with was this idea of kind of revisiting volume load. So volume load was kind of the original way to calculate volume, sets times reps times load lifted. That's how you'd see it in all the research papers. Probably everybody had it in their spreadsheets. I know I did at one time, but then it kind of fell out of favor because it became considerably less useful in predicting the actual outcomes in size and strength that we're concerned with. So a very easy example for this is when looking at research that investigates high and low loads. You have two groups training 3 sets to failure, one with 80%, one with 30%. The low load condition, because they're doing so many more repetitions, is going to accumulate way, way, way more volume load. And ultimately, those led to similar adaptations in size and isometric strength, 1RM strength less so. But ultimately, the volume load did not predict the outcomes there. And so it kind of fell out of favor for a long time. I think a lot of people still use it to kind of track progress within an individual and within a movement, which I think it's totally helpful there because it's going to account for increasing reps at a given weight or also increasing load at a given amount of reps. Totally useful there. But I think other than that, it's kind of, like I said, fell out of favor for hard sets, relative volume, effective reps recently, different things like that. So the one thing I thought that it's pretty useful for, though, is that it is a kind of quantitative metric for how much work you're doing. I don't necessarily think that's going to be indicative adaptation. Like, I don't think you should just blow your volume load through the roof for the sake of it. But if you are having these recurrent things where you continuously hit this symptomatic threshold, it may stand a reason to at least give it a shot to like try to increase what I'm going to call your work capacity, which is basically defined as the amount of weekly volume load that you can tolerate, and see if that gives it a shot. Or that allows you to surpass that threshold. Okay, so that's kind of the high-arching idea there. From a practical perspective, all this really means is I have like kind of two main observations. Number one, originally with a lot of, the modern thinking on, pain science and things like that, you kind of have heard practitioners talk about these two things that are related to symptoms, which would be like a load threshold or like a volume threshold. So a load threshold would just be, when I hit this load or this weight on the bar, that's generally when my symptoms start. A volume threshold would be if I do this much work, that's when my symptoms start. In my experience, I see load thresholds way, way more often. That's not to say that the volume isn't going to contribute to symptoms at all. Like if you do 10 sets of 10 at a symptomatic load versus 1 set of 10, obviously I think that's probably going to be related to your symptoms to some degree. But in general, I've found load thresholds to be considerably more common. So when you hit this load, that's when you start to experience symptoms. So my idea was, okay, in the short term, let's take a step back. let's stay below this symptomatic load, which is common sense and what simple approaches to graded exposure would do as well. But then let's just literally take the idea of load progression out of our minds for a little bit and just literally focus on accumulating as much volume load as possible and getting that tolerance or that work capacity up prior to moving on. And so from a practical perspective, all that really looks like is just focusing on rep progression rather than load progression. So I start with a given load that is asymptomatic and take that from 5 reps to 8 reps to 10 reps to 15 reps and even up to 20 reps, which a lot of people don't like for multi-joint exercises, but I found that to be extremely useful because we know, again, from that previous research I discussed, increasing repetitions at a given load is way more potent of a way to increase the total work done than increasing the load. And the idea would be after you do that for a while, you can start splitting that total number of reps into more sets. So now I'm doing 2 sets of 10 at an asymptomatic load and start working the reps up with those individual sets. So now I'm doing 2 sets of 12, 2 sets of 14, 2 sets of 16, and then I split those again. And I'm really elevating the amount of total work that I'm doing. And then eventually, which has at least been my observation thus far, you have improved your work capacity and just tolerance of training considerably at that point. The first couple of weeks doing sets of 20 isn't very fun, but you start to adapt to it pretty quickly, cardiovascularly, muscularly. You don't get nearly as sore, those kind of things. And anecdotally, at least, that has seemed to be pretty positive in terms of mitigating symptoms and allowing people to take steps forward. And after you've kind of done this initial period of working on your work capacity, then we can get back to good old classic load progression and get us back to kind of that normal area of training. And so the thing that Josh mentioned originally here that I kind of sat and thought about as well that I think is hilarious is, we can always come back to these old school periodization models with kind of a fresh perspective. We always talk about how, periodization may have like a neutral to positive effect in our minds, but our version of periodization is very different of like what we would consider the older school models that are pretty strict and rigid in the way that they were applied. But looking back in many of these periodization models, there was like this muscle endurance or work capacity phase. And I continuously ask myself now with a lot of this stuff, like, was periodization the chicken or the egg in that kind of, scenario? Were these coaches making these observations of things that were anecdotally successful and then just preemptively kind of integrated these strategies and kind of called it this periodization model and then put on the back end all of this physiological rationale? Or was it the kind of the other way around where they took this physiological rationale and that just so happened to map to the observations that we have? I don't know the answer to that, but I just think it's interesting that this kind of thinking was in the very first phase of a lot of periodization models. So people go to competition, they push their bodies to the absolute limit. Then in addition to that, they had a decrease in training volume, very similar to what would happen with an injury. You take a huge step back, you potentially have that kind of detraining period happening. And then kind of the thing they did was to accumulate, a bunch of work to get that capacity back prior to moving on to the kind of the other training phases. So I just think that's an interesting kind of connection there that, I've come to that kind of conclusion myself. At least this is a useful tool in certain scenarios for potentially similar reasons. Obviously the thing with periodization that's a little bit more challenging is that it's kind of a little bit of a strict thing to say this is always necessary. That's probably not the case, but in certain scenarios that may be useful. And when you paint on the entire context of why periodization was in the first place, they have an entire team of individuals that they have to manage the training for. So you got 40 people in a training hall that you're trying to get to do something productive. In those days, individualizing training probably was a little bit more difficult logistically. So you have everybody do something similar that tries to capture most of these effects that potentially could be useful for different problems that they solve frequently. So I just think that's an interesting observation, and hopefully this can at least give some people some idea fuel if you've been dealing with something for a long time. I think it's just another way of kind of going about that, graded exposure process. But anecdotally for more chronic issues, this has been something that's been pretty successful for me, although it's not always fun initially. I think one of the reasons I was initially apprehensive is like, we've talked about it before, very high rep sets on multi-joint exercises are both not fun, but they also have a very high degree of perception of discomfort. And maybe that's going to limit, the proximity to failure in which people take sets, and potentially that's going to harm things. But I eventually got past that, in part due to our kind of segment last week, where we kind of, not last week, but last podcast, where we kind of have not super clear evidence on the proximity to failure necessary with lower loads. So, that isn't like an immediate, you should not do this. And I think this can potentially help to explain, we've talked about before, when people come off injuries, there's sometimes this like super fast rate of progress. And a lot of times, one of the things you're doing is you're decreasing the load and trying to, just do a bunch of higher reps because that's something that people can tolerate. And then maybe when they get back to normal training, they're just able to recover better and really thrive on the batch of training that they're ultimately settling on. So, a lot of anecdotes here, and I want that to be clear. And this is mostly just ideal fuel for something that I've been noticing as a coach recently, and with my own training as well. I've been doing this for 6 weeks now, and anecdotally, it's going well so far. So yeah, Josh, I don't know if you have anything to ask or additional thoughts there, but that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah. So would it be a fair characterization to kind of sum it up and say that it's basically a double progression? And just to make sure everyone's on the same page, a double progression is basically just when you have two variables that you're manipulating in that, like, so like a traditional double progression would be like two sets of, or whatever, 3 sets of 8 to 12. You basically add reps until you can hang out at the top of that rep range. Okay, now we add load next week type of thing. Probably bump you down to the lower end of the range, rinse and repeat. So would it be a fair characterization to say that this is basically a double progression of increasing the total amount of work you're doing before adding load?
Yeah, I would say the only difference from what I'm advocating for in a traditional double progression is that volume load probably goes down in some scenarios when you add load there, because you're decreasing the number of repetitions. Again, I don't think volume load is indicative of adaptation necessarily, so that's a very important piece to kind of think about. What you're trying to do with this is build this theoretical capacity prior to moving on to this kind of mental framework of normal progression. So this is going to take you to a place where on paper is just elevating this total amount of work. So the difference is a traditional double progression, 3 sets of 8 to 12, like you mentioned. Week 1, 3 sets of 8 of the load, then I go to 3 sets of 12, I add load, but then I go back to 3 sets of 8. Even though that's with a greater load, the volume load is going to drop. And what I'm saying is we're trying to maintain the total amount of repetitions. And then once we get to a certain point or the top end of the rep range that an individual would want to work at, then we split the total number of repetitions into more sets and then continue to do the same thing. So maybe we start with 3 sets of 10, get that up to 3 sets of 14, and then maybe we go a couple sets of 7 instead, and then we work those up into sets of 12 or whatever. And the increasing thing is the total amount of repetitions just continues to rise. So you're always trying to maintain that rather than dropping the total number of repetitions after you add the load, if that makes sense.
When you say a couple sets of 7, you mean a couple sets of 7 per 1 set of 14 before?
Yeah. So let's say we start with 1 set of 14. You get there, then maybe we split that into 2 sets of 7 with a slightly heavier load. So still 14 repetitions and slightly greater load. Then we would work those 2 sets of 7 up to sets of 14 again. And now maybe we're doing 4 sets of 7 and with a slightly heavier load again, and that kind of pattern.
I've found myself doing this, but in a different way. So like, instead of doing really high reps in this scenario, I'll just add sets. And even though they're like really easy, like the reason they're really easy is because you're working back from an acre of pain. So I might try to work up, and just in terms of number of sets accrued at a relatively light load, build some more capacity there. Okay, now we can start kind of polarizing these sets. Maybe we worked up to like 5 or 6 sets of 5 with a tolerable load. We're cruising. Okay, now let's make that first set 10% heavier. Then let's make it 15% heavier. Okay, now let's move it to top triples. Okay, now eventually we're back to a top single or whatever is normal for that individual. So like, it's a similar concept that I've stumbled upon, is like, okay, let's get back to normal. Let's get some confidence. let's progress in terms of the total work you're doing, which can be quantified as volume load. And then we can start to kind of push the envelope for 1 or 2 sets for load as we feel comfortable.
Yep.
Would that
Yeah.
be a similar concept?
Yeah, I think that because I would do that as like a standard way of thinking about it, and I think that's probably like in the middle of the spectrum of like super simple graded exposure with load of like, you know, working back a little bit and then just slowly adding load each week. What you're saying is kind of somewhere in the middle. The reason I've kind of stumbled on this approach is primarily 2 things. One, the loading threshold for the individual is pretty darn low in terms of the percentage of their 1RM. And that's why I would say this is definitely not something I would come to for a vast majority of the people. I think it's a pretty drastic thing, and probably for more chronic stuff that, you know, other approaches that are more simple hasn't worked. So the percentage of 1RM that the load threshold that they experience symptoms at is pretty darn low. And so the thing I was trying to come up with is like, you know, if you're already using a very low percentage of your 1RM, that's already, for a lot of people that are motivated by strength progress, that's already pretty hard to mentally commit to. So you had to find a way to try to make training hard and try to make something that you could progress. And so really the only thing I could think of at the time was like, yeah, it sucks, but doing a set of 20 on squats is a different experience that you kind of have to get psyched up for, and it kind of feels like you're training again. And it's very different, of course, but that kind of helps in both ways. It helps the athletes buy in the sense that they can see progression week to week in the reps that they're doing at a given load. If you take the reps to a relatively, you know, noticeable RP or even just a perception of discomfort, it feels like I'm training, even though the loads are considerably less. And then it also is going to aid, you know, in the accumulation of volume load as long as those repetitions are going up week to week. So like I said, it's more of a drastic strategy that I've come across in those specific scenarios when the symptomatic load threshold is pretty low, in which I think a more conservative approach, what you're describing, where, you know, maybe you're somewhere in those 5s to 7s reps, add a few sets there, and then start kind of increasing one of those top sets to get back to quote unquote normal programming that we might have for an individual. I think that's definitely kind of option A. Like that's what I would try first. If that, for whatever reason, doesn't allow you to you know, take a step behind that loading threshold, then maybe some of these more drastic approaches could be utilized. But yeah, I just wanted to make that clear. It's definitely not something I would, you know, advocate for off the bat, but in some scenarios, I found it to be pretty useful.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's like actually a really, really good take home is if you're running into tolerance issues and you're not kind of able to just have a smooth transition back with increasing load week to week, and you kind of find yourself in, okay, this is going to take longer than a couple weeks. All right, let's see if we can't add work somehow before focusing on that load progression, right? And it gives you it gives you something to focus on. It gives you something to train hard for. It gives you something to feel like you're progressing on, which can kind of get the ball rolling.
100%.
Because yeah, man, like every single time, every single scenario I can think of right now in which this potential approach would be useful, it is a kind of like a load threshold issue that is aggravating it. Like, honestly, that's probably 9 times out of 10 that someone has an ache or pain is probably, at least in my experience, is because there's a certain load at which, you know, things start to act up.
And the last thing I'll say is that another huge benefit to this is I found it desensitizes people to like negative anticipation, because you're using the exact same load for quite a while until you kind of reach your upper end threshold of whatever you're going to start breaking the total number of repetitions up into more sets. That load's just not scary anymore because, you know, you've done it for however long. So it kind of, again, gets that cycle of negative expectations to kind of stop, and then we can kind of take steps forward again. Whereas if, you know, you're going load progression, sometimes, not always, but, you know, individuals can start looking forward, you know, even from that first week of progression and be like, I don't know, like today already started to feel a little bit of something. I'm still fine, but in a few weeks, I'm not sure. Whereas this, it's like, yeah, I use this weight and I'm going to keep using this weight till I get a set of 20 with it, to which the next load jump, I did a set of 20 with the other one and I was fine. I can do a set of 5 with this and be okay. It just, like, to me, it's like from that perspective too, I found it to be particularly useful. But again, that's a pretty anecdotal case, and maybe is not always going to apply, but something that I do think is can be potentially useful.
Yeah, I think a general theme we've just kind of landed upon with training in general is that it can be helpful to make things feel linear when they're not truly linear. So, in the example of working back from an acre of pain, it's absolutely not going to be a linear process. But if you can manipulate your progression scheme to make it feel more or less linear, that can be a huge psychological win to get the ball rolling. Similar idea if someone isn't managing an acre of pain and they're just training as normal. Yes, of course, top end strength is not going to be a linear increase week to week. But if you can set up a training block so that you're adding weight to the bar each week and you kind of get that quote unquote artificial progression, that can also get the ball rolling from a psychological perspective, which can lead to actual progress, right? So I think that's just like something we always kind of end up steering towards in a practical sense, because those psychological factors are so vital. And I think, again, this is a good example of that. Cool. Good to wrap it up there, man. Awesome. Appreciate you guys tuning in to episode 31. Like Zach said, links to studies we mentioned will be in the description. You can also check out the description to check out some of the stuff that we offer. Sign up for our mailing list, see the programming and coaching stuff that we offer. And also, it's also beneficial if you're able to leave a rating and review on your podcast player of choice. That is much appreciated. And we'll see you in the next episode. Take care.